3 words. That's all it took. Not a grand declaration, not a raised fist, not a hero arriving on cue with fire in his eyes. Just 3 quiet words, spoken into a narrow corridor, into a charged and breathless moment, and everything shifted. "She's with me." He didn't shout them. He didn't even step forward dramatically. He simply said them the way a mountain simply exists, with a weight so calm, so certain, so completely unmovable, that the man on the receiving end blinked, just once, and the carefully constructed architecture of his control began to quietly collapse. If you have ever wished, in your deepest, most private moments, that someone would show up at exactly the right time, not to save you, but simply to stand beside you, then this is the story you have been waiting for. Stay with me. It's just getting started. April Sinclair had a specific relationship with precision. She was 36 years old, the founder and CEO of a real estate investment firm that managed a portfolio most people in her industry wouldn't see until their 50s. She wore burgundy the way other women wore armor. She moved through rooms the way chess players think 3 moves ahead, mapping exits, calculating leverage, weighing every word before it left her mouth. She was not a woman who stumbled. She was not a woman who needed rescuing. She was, however, a woman who had spent 2 years with a man who had made an art form of making her feel less sure of her own mind. And tonight, in a narrow corridor inside one of Manhattan's most discreet restaurants, that man had found her again. The Celeste restaurant occupied the kind of space that made people straighten their posture the moment they walked through the door. Located on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, it wore its reputation quietly. No neon signs, no loud branding, just a discreet brass plate beside a dark wooden door that had been polished every morning for 11 years. Inside, the lighting was warm and deliberate. Crystal glasses caught candlelight and multiplied it into something almost intimate. Conversations were low, measured, performed. April had eaten here 14 times. She knew the Maître d' by name. She knew which table offered the best acoustics for a negotiation, and which corner allowed a private moment without witnesses. Tonight she had chosen the corner, not for business, but because her best friend had cancelled at the last minute, and April had refused to go home before 10 o'clock. Going home early felt like surrender, and April Sinclair did not surrender. She was in a deep burgundy dress that skimmed her figure without announcing it. Her dark hair was pulled back at the neck, a few strands deliberately loose. Her heels added 3 inches to a presence that didn't need them. She moved through the restaurant the way she moved through boardrooms, like she had already calculated every exit. She was heading toward the restroom when she saw him. Marcus. He was standing in the narrow corridor between the private dining rooms, a glass of Bordeaux in one hand, wearing a charcoal suit that fit too well. He had the jawline of a man who had been photographed often and knew it. His smile had never once been warm, despite years of practice. He was the kind of man who understood that appearance was leverage, and who deployed that understanding with the patience of a surgeon. April. His voice landed like a hand on her shoulder she hadn't agreed to. She stopped. Not out of fear. She had been afraid of Marcus once, and she had spent 2 years carefully, methodically dismantling that particular habit. She stopped because the corridor was narrow, and he had already positioned himself to occupy most of it. That was always the architecture of it. Never aggressive enough to be called out. Never subtle enough to be imagined. Just the adjusted angle, the lowered voice, the way he made small spaces feel smaller. "I didn't know you were here tonight," she said, keeping her voice even. "Of course you didn't." He stepped closer. "You look incredible, by the way. You always look incredible when you're trying not to be noticed." "I'm not trying to be anything," she said. "And I'm heading somewhere." "You're always heading somewhere." He tilted his head. "That was always the problem, wasn't it? You were always moving. Never quite present." April felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not pain. Not fear. Something older. The memory of standing in his apartment while he rearranged her sentences until she couldn't remember what she'd originally meant to say. She had been 28 then. She was 36 now, and considerably less interested in being rearranged. She stepped to the right. He stepped with her. Such a small movement. Anyone watching would have seen nothing. That was always the genius of it, invisible from the outside, suffocating from within. "I've been thinking," Marcus continued, swirling his glass lightly, "that we should have a real conversation. There are things I should have." "She's with me." The voice came from the left. Low. Unhurried. Carrying the particular weight of someone who had never needed volume to be heard. April turned. The man standing beside her was not from this world. Not the world of Celeste Restaurant. Not the world of Bordeaux and tailored charcoal suits and calculated smiles. He was wearing dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled to the forearm in a way that suggested the formality had been added recently, a last-minute concession to the dress code. His hands were the hands of someone who worked with them. There was a callus along the right palm. He wasn't wearing a watch. He was looking at Marcus. Not with hostility. That was what made it so disorienting. There was no threat in his expression, no performance of dominance. There was simply a calm that felt geological, like something formed over centuries under tremendous pressure, and entirely unmoved by the temperature of a room. His eyes were dark and steady, and they rested on Marcus the way a mountain rests on the ground beneath it. Without effort. Without apology. Without the slightest interest in being challenged. Marcus blinked. Just once. April caught it. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, the Polish on his voice thinning slightly. "And you are?" The man didn't answer immediately. He let the silence do its work. Then, unhurried. "Someone who's been waiting for her." 3 seconds passed. Marcus looked between them, recalibrating, reassembling the smile that had slipped a fraction. "Right," he said finally. And then he lifted his glass in something that wanted to be gracious, and wasn't quite, and he walked away. April stood very still in the corridor. The man beside her didn't speak. He wasn't looking at her yet. His gaze followed Marcus until Marcus had disappeared around the corner, the way someone checks that a door is actually closed before turning back to the room. Then he looked at her. And she looked at him. It lasted longer than it should have. Not because either of them planned it. He had no angle, no follow-through. His expression held nothing she could identify as calculation, just a kind of quiet attentiveness, like someone listening to a piece of music they hadn't heard before and weren't sure yet what to make of it. April Sinclair had been looked at by powerful men her entire adult life. She knew every variation of that look. Desire dressed as admiration. Ambition dressed as interest. Possession dressed as care. She had a taxonomy for all of it. This didn't fit anywhere in the taxonomy. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He nodded once. "You had it handled." "I did," she said. And then, because something in her was still calibrating, but it was faster with help. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something that preceded one. He stepped back, giving her the corridor. And April walked toward the restroom with her pulse doing something entirely unprofessional, and the unsettling certainty that she had just been seen. Not by someone who wanted something from her. Simply by someone who had been paying attention. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why that felt like the beginning of something. The most dangerous thing he did was nothing dramatic. He simply stood beside her, and somehow, that was everything. Carter's garage sat on a corner in Red Hook, Brooklyn, like it had never considered moving. No sleek signage, no digital display, no attempt to be anything other than exactly what it was, a working garage with oil-stained concrete floors and the permanent smell of metal and grease embedded in every surface. The roll-up door was open to the Saturday morning air, and the sound of something classic played low on a Bluetooth speaker, drifting out onto the sidewalk like an invitation that wasn't trying too hard. April sat in her car across the street for 4 minutes before she got out. She had told herself 3 different stories about why she was here. The first involved research. She was considering investing in independent auto businesses as part of a portfolio diversification, which was technically true and entirely irrelevant. The second involved closure. She simply wanted to thank him properly, the kind of thing a person with good manners did. The third story she didn't examine too closely, because it involved the way she had lain awake at 1 a.m. Thursday and again at 3 a.m. Friday. Not anxious, not stressed, just awake with a particular quality of wakefulness that felt like waiting for something she couldn't name. She was wearing dark-fitted trousers and a camel-colored blazer over a white shirt, top button open. Not business, not casual, the deliberate in-between of someone who had spent more time getting dressed than she intended to admit. Inside the garage, 2 motorcycles stood in various states of assembly. One pair of boots was visible beneath a Harley-Davidson suspended on a low platform. Classic black, the kind of machine that looked like it had a history. April stepped inside and waited, because she had learned long ago that walking into someone else's space and immediately filling it with noise was a form of bad manners that boardrooms had mistakenly classified as confidence. The boots moved. There was the sound of something being set down, a wrench, by the weight of it, and then Alexander Carter slid out from beneath the motorcycle with the unhurried ease of someone completely at home in their own skin. He sat up, saw her, and for one unguarded moment his expression did something he didn't have time to edit. A brief, unperformed surprise, followed by something quieter that settled in his eyes and stayed there. He reached for a cloth tucked into his back pocket and wiped his hands. He didn't scramble to his feet immediately. He took a breath. He stood the way people stand when they're not performing standing. "You found it," he said. "I have GPS," she said. "And a driver who looked slightly concerned when I gave him the address." Red Hook tends to do that to drivers from Tribeca. In the daylight, away from the muted gold of Celeste's corridor lighting, he was different. Not less, more specific. The lines of his face were unhurried. The jaw slightly shadowed. The dark eyes holding that same quality of attention she remembered, and had been unable to stop thinking about since. He was wearing a worn grey t-shirt and work jeans, and he looked entirely, infuriatingly comfortable. "I came to thank you properly," she said. "Thursday night. You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." There was no but attached. No angle being set up. Just the clean acknowledgement of a choice he'd made without requiring her to validate it. April tilted her head slightly. Most people follow that with something, an explanation, a justification. Most people feel like they need one. "You want coffee?" he asked. "I've got a pot that's been sitting for about 20 minutes, so it's either perfect or a crime against caffeine, depending on your standards." She should have said no. She had a call at noon and 3 emails that qualified as urgent by any reasonable definition. She had a board member attempting to reach her since Thursday with the particular persistence of someone who wanted to renegotiate something she had already decided. "Sure," she said. The small office at the back of the garage was unexpectedly human. A desk buried under invoices and mechanical manuals, a shelf with 3 framed photographs she didn't examine closely enough to identify, a coffee maker that had clearly been used with devotion. He poured 2 mugs without asking how she took it, then raised an eyebrow. "Black," she said. Something in his expression registered approval. He didn't vocalize it. They stood on either side of the desk because there was only one chair, and neither moved toward it, which created a particular geometry. Close enough for a real conversation, far enough for the pretense of formality. "You always work Saturdays?" she asked. "When there's something worth working on?" He nodded toward the Harley through the doorway. "She belonged to my father. I've been rebuilding her for about 8 months. 8 months for one motorcycle. She deserves it." He said it simply, no sentimentality, but with a weight that made the sentence mean more than its words. Some things are worth taking your time with. April felt the sentence land somewhere slightly below her sternum. She took a sip of coffee. It was, in fact, perfect. She looked at him over the rim of the mug. "I don't do this," she said. "Do what?" "Show up somewhere without a reason that holds up under scrutiny." He considered that. Not rushing to fill the space, not offering her an easier interpretation. Just letting it exist between them, which was simultaneously the most uncomfortable and most honest thing anyone had done in her presence in recent memory. "And does it?" he asked finally. "Hold up under scrutiny?" April set the mug down on the edge of the desk. Outside, a car passed. The Saturday morning light moved across the garage floor in a slow, unhurried stripe. "I haven't decided yet," she said. She left 12 minutes later, and for the entire drive back across the bridge, she could still detect it, faint, persistent, impossible, The smell of motor oil and something warm underneath it settled into the fabric of her blazer like it had always been there, waiting for exactly this moment to make itself known. Belle. If this story is reaching something real inside you, something you felt but never had words for, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Part 2 is where everything deepens. Where two completely different worlds begin to understand each other. Where a laugh, one single, unguarded laugh, changes everything. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been seen by someone who wanted nothing from you? Tell us where you're listening from. Times. Part 2. The visits, the wrench, and the laugh. 2,800 words times where two worlds begin to speak the same language. Here is what April told herself. The visits had a practical dimension. She was a woman who operated on frameworks. Cause, purpose, measurable outcome. The first time she returned to Carter's garage, she brought a pretext, a question about the Harley's engine rebuild that she had researched the night before, specifically so the visit would have a legitimate reason attached to it. She had identified the make, the model year, the particular challenge of sourcing authentic parts for a machine of that era. She had done her homework. She arrived prepared. What she had not prepared for was being handed a wrench. Alexander had accepted the coffee, answered her question about carburetors without making her feel that the pretext was visible, and then, without ceremony or explanation, turned back to the motorcycle and said, "Hold this." He placed a specific component in her hands and showed her exactly where to position it while he worked the other side. She held it for 20 minutes. Her manicure did not survive. She did not mention it. He did not acknowledge it. But when they were done, and he had stepped back to assess the work with the slow, considered gaze of someone who understood that the difference between a good job and a perfect one was never rushed, he glanced at her hands briefly. "Thank you," he said. "Don't mention it," she said. And meant it. The third time, she didn't bring a question. He didn't ask for one. By the fourth visit, there was a second stool near the workbench that hadn't been there before. Neither of them acknowledged it. She sat on it and read through briefs on her phone while he worked, and the silence between them was the specific kind that didn't ask anything of either person, comfortable in a way that April, who had spent years in rooms full of people she couldn't fully relax around, found quietly astonishing. The visits had no official name. That was the first thing April noticed, the absence of a category for what she was doing. Everything in her life had a category. Meetings had agendas. Calls had objectives. Even her rare social engagements had a function, a context, a reason that could withstand a calendar audit. But showing up at a Red Hook garage on a Tuesday morning with 2 coffees and no explanation that would survive professional scrutiny, that didn't fit anywhere in the existing architecture of her days. She came anyway. There are people who fill silence with themselves. And there are people who make silence feel like company. Alexander Carter was the second kind, and April had forgotten such people existed. It was on a Wednesday in early October that coincidence, or something that wore coincidence's clothing, arranged the next chapter. April's assistant had typed the wrong pier number. A client meeting scheduled for Pier 17 had become, due to a single transposed digit, a 40-minute detour to Pier 1, Brooklyn Bridge Park. By the time April had identified the discrepancy, her driver was merging onto the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, and turning back would cost her time she didn't have. She had rescheduled the meeting with 3 words, something came up, and found herself standing on the waterfront in a charcoal wool coat, feeling the particular frustration of a perfectly structured day developing a crack. Then she had smelled the coffee. The cafe occupied a narrow space at the edge of the park. No advertising. Windows facing the East River. On a Wednesday afternoon in early October, the water was doing that particular thing it did in autumn, catching the low light and holding it like it was in no hurry to let go. The Manhattan skyline rose across the water, sharp and certain. April had been sitting at a window table with her laptop and a courte-do she hadn't planned on ordering when the door opened and Alexander walked in. He saw her at the exact same moment she saw him. The pause lasted 1 breath. His expression did that thing again, the unedited version, before whatever filter most people applied had time to engage. Genuine surprise. And then, following it so closely it was almost part of the same motion, something that looked a great deal like quiet satisfaction. "Wrong address," he said, stopping beside her table. "Remarkably specific guess." You're not a Wednesday afternoon waterfront person. He glanced at her laptop, her posture, the core to do. You're a conference room person who ended up here by accident and decided to make it work. April studied him for a moment. And you? I live 4 blocks from here. This is my Wednesday afternoon. He nodded toward the counter. I'll get my coffee and let you work. You don't have to. She stopped, started again. You can sit down if you want. He did. What followed was not what April would have predicted. She had expected the careful performance of 2 people still figuring out the rules, managed conversation, deliberate charm, the architecture of a first real meeting dressed as coincidence. What she got instead was an argument about infrastructure. It began with Alexander noticing the city development proposal open on her screen, a waterfront district plan for Lower Manhattan, and making a comment about load-bearing assumptions that was technically outside his lane and entirely correct. April told him so, the second part first. He raised an eyebrow. She explained the structural flaw in his reasoning. He disagreed specifically and without apology. She pushed back. He didn't move. How you think because you financed 3 waterfront developments, you understand how they're actually built, he said. I think because I financed 3 waterfront developments, I understand what makes them viable. Viable and built are 2 different conversations. Not when you're the one deciding whether they happen. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts challenge and something warmer, something that hadn't decided what it was yet. You always lead with the money, he said. The money is what makes everything else possible. The money is what makes the version that gets approved possible, he said. Which is not always the same thing as the version that should exist. April opened her mouth. Closed it. The distinction was inconveniently valid. They disagreed about 3 more things in the next 40 minutes. Urban green space allocation, the relationship between aesthetic design and structural integrity, and whether a building could have a soul, which April said was not a useful variable, and Alexander said was the only one that mattered. That's not something you can put in a proposal, she said. No, he said. But you know it when it's missing. Outside, a tugboat moved across the river, slow and purposeful. The cafe had filled around them, a young couple by the door, a man with headphones, 2 women sharing something on a phone, but their table had developed its own atmosphere, separate from the room, pressurized in a specific and not unpleasant way. April was aware, had been aware for the last 20 minutes with increasing inconvenience, of the exact distance between her hand on the table and his, resting near his coffee cup with the easy stillness of hands that knew how to be patient. Then it happened. The laugh. It arrived without warning, without cause she could immediately identify, sparked by something he said about a particularly catastrophic city planning decision involving a bike lane and a structural column, delivered with such dry precision that her body simply responded before her composure had time to intercept it. Not the measured smile she gave in interviews. Not the polished chuckle of a woman who knew she was being watched. A real laugh, sudden, unguarded, briefly uncontrollable. The kind that left a silence afterward that felt clean and slightly dangerous. Alexander went still. Not uncomfortably. Just still, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully translate. Something careful and open at the same time. Like someone witnessing something they hadn't expected and weren't sure they deserved to see. That doesn't happen often, she said. Not quite to him. I know, he said quietly. And the fact that he said I know instead of I'm glad or you should do that more, the fact that he simply acknowledged it without trying to own it or reproduce it, settled somewhere in April's chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't realized was there. She closed her laptop at 4:47 p.m. She had meant to leave at 3. Times. The call came on a Thursday night at 1:47 a.m. April was at her kitchen island, white marble, city lights visible through floor-to-ceiling glass, the penthouse quiet in the way expensive spaces are quiet, which is to say thoroughly and artificially, when the corporate crisis arrived in her phone. A board member had leaked preliminary acquisition figures to a financial journalist. The story was running at 6 a.m. The numbers were wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough to move markets in a direction that would require 3 days of careful, visible damage control. April sat with her contacts open. She scrolled past her lead attorney. Past her COO. Past the board chair, whose number she had memorized and dialed in the dark more times than she could count. Her thumb stopped on Alexander's name. She stared at it for a moment. Then pressed call. It rang twice. His voice arrived on the third ring, low, slightly roughened by sleep, unhurried even at 1:47 in the morning. Like waking to an unscheduled call at this hour was simply another thing that happened, and he had decided in advance to meet it without alarm. "Hey," he said. Just that. Not "is everything okay?" Not "do you know what time it is?" Just her name acknowledged in a voice that made space. April exhaled. And then she talked. She talked about the leak and the journalist and the numbers and the board member whose identity she already knew with 90% certainty. She talked about the 6 a.m. window and the market implications and the secondary problem that lived underneath the first one. She talked with the velocity and precision of someone who spent her professional life translating complex situations into actionable language. And Alexander listened, without interrupting, without offering solutions she hadn't asked for, without the particular kind of helpfulness that dressed itself as support but was mostly the need to be useful. He just listened. When she finished, the silence lasted 4 seconds. "The board member who leaked," he said. "Is this the first time, or the first time it's gotten out?" April paused. "Second time. Different information, same direction." "Then the leak isn't the problem. The leak is the symptom." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "You already knew that?" "Yes." "So what do you actually need at 2 a.m.? The question was so direct, and so absent of judgment, that April felt something in her chest shift sideways. What did she actually need? Not strategy, she had that. Not legal counsel, she had that too. Not reassurance, which she had trained herself not to require. "I needed to say it out loud," she said finally. "To someone who wasn't inside the building." "Okay," he said simply. Like that was a completely reasonable thing to need, and he was glad she'd called. They stayed on the line for another 11 minutes. He asked 2 more questions, both precise, both useful, and mostly remained present in the particular way that presence can be felt, even through a phone at 2 a.m. When they hung up, April set her phone face down on the marble counter and sat in the silence of her penthouse for a long time. She had not called her attorney. She had not called her COO. She had not called the board chair. She had called a man who rebuilt motorcycles in Red Hook, and somehow, that had been exactly what the situation required. The next morning, after 3 hours of sleep and 4 hours of precise, effective damage control, April drove to Brooklyn. She didn't call ahead. She walked into the garage at 11 a.m., and Alexander looked up from the Harley. This time, his expression was different. Not surprised, not the quiet satisfaction of the cafe. Something more deliberate. More considered. The expression of a man who had spent the previous night understanding something, and had decided by morning what to do with it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached for the second stool, moved it just slightly closer to the workbench, 6 inches, no more, and said, "Coffee's fresh." He didn't mention the call. He didn't need to. The stool had moved 6 inches. Just enough. And it said everything neither of them was ready to put into words, yet. Red heart hash. We are now standing at the edge of something. 2 people from completely different worlds, drawn together by accident, held together by something far more honest than convenience. Part 3 is where it all comes together, and where it nearly falls apart. If this story is touching something real in you, subscribe right now, leave a like, and tell us in the comments, what's the bravest thing someone has ever done for you, quietly, without asking for anything back? Times the complete ending, and the lesson it leaves behind. Alexander had described it as the real Brooklyn. April had interpreted this as mild provocation, the kind of thing people said when they wanted to imply that your version of a place was somehow less legitimate than theirs. She had been to Brooklyn. Gallery openings in Dumbo. A fundraiser in Park Slope. A dinner in Cobble Hill written up in 3 separate lifestyle publications. She knew Brooklyn. She did not, it turned out, know this Brooklyn. They met at the garage at 7 on a Friday evening. Carter's garage did not typically close before 9 on a Friday. She only understood this was significant when she saw the rolled-down door and the padlock. He had closed early. He was waiting outside in a dark jacket, no tie, the kind of effortless put-together that had nothing to do with effort. He looked at her, camel coat, dark jeans, ankle boots with a heel. That added confidence to a stride that didn't need it. He said nothing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. They walked not toward anything April could identify on a map, but through streets that had their own logic, past a mural covering an entire building in colors that had no business being that vivid in October, past a corner store where Alexander exchanged a few words with the owner in the easy shorthand of people who had been neighbors for years, past a small park where two men played chess under a single working streetlight with the focused solemnity of a professional match. "You grew up here," April said. It wasn't a question. Red Hook specifically. "My father had the garage. His father had it before him." He said it without nostalgia, just fact, but the kind of fact that had weight. "Third generation. And you never wanted to leave." He glanced at her sideways. "Did you always want to stay?" April considered that. She had come to Manhattan at 22 with a business degree, $40,000 in student debt, and a specific and non-negotiable intention to build something that couldn't be taken from her. Staying had never been the word for it, she said. Staying implies passivity. "I planted." "That's different." "Is it?" The bar had no name visible from the street, just a door, dark wood, a small amber light above it that you would miss if you weren't looking. Inside, it was narrow and warm, exposed brick walls, a bartender who nodded at Alexander like he was expected. The music was something with a trumpet and a bass line that moved through the floorboards rather than the air. The lighting was the color of late evening. April had been to bars that cost 4 times as much to look half as good as this. Alexander ordered without consulting a menu. Whiskey neat. And a glass of something for her that arrived moments later and turned out to be exactly right, which she did not comment on, because commenting on it would require acknowledging that he had paid attention to what she'd ordered at the cafe 2 weeks ago. She had paid attention too. They talked about the city, what it had been and what it was becoming, and whether those were 2 parts of the same story or 2 separate ones. He had opinions that were specific and unsentimental and occasionally uncomfortable, and April disagreed with approximately half of them and found herself genuinely energized by the disagreement in a way that board meetings, despite their stated purpose, rarely produced. At some point the bar had filled further, and the space around them had compressed naturally, the way crowded rooms do, bodies redistributing to accommodate new arrivals. She was aware of it peripherally, the way you're aware of weather changing, until the man behind her shifted, and she stepped forward automatically, and the distance between her and Alexander went from conversational to something that didn't have a professional category. She started to step back. A gust of cold air swept through as someone opened the street door. The involuntary shiver that moved through her body carried her forward instead. Just a small, unplanned movement. Barely an inch. But enough that she reached out instinctively for balance, and her hand found the lapel of his jacket. His hands found her waist. It was a reflex. She knew it was a reflex, the automatic steadying of someone who had seen her pitch forward and responded before thought had time to supervise instinct. But the reflex didn't correct and withdraw. His hands stayed. One on each side. Light but definite. And she was standing close enough now to be aware of the warmth that came off him, and the specific quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of someone making a conscious decision not to move. 3 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. April looked up. He was already looking at her, not with the calculating assessment she knew how to navigate, not with the performed desire that had always felt like a transaction, but with something open and careful and entirely undefended, like a man who had decided that honesty was the only currency he knew how to spend. Neither of them spoke. The trumpet in the music landed on a long-held note that seemed to understand the room. Then someone laughed loudly near the door, and the spell didn't break so much as expand, becoming something both of them were now standing inside of rather than just on the edge of. His hands dropped slowly. She stepped back 1 inch. Not 2. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "Yes," she said. The word came out softer than she intended. She picked up her glass, looked at the bar rather than at him, because looking at him right now required a composure she was still in the process of reassembling. When she finally glanced back, He was watching her with that expression she still hadn't found a name for, the one that made her feel like she was being read, not for what she presented, but for what she hadn't said yet. The night was far from over, and neither of them made any move to end it. Times. The rain arrived on a Tuesday without apology. By mid-morning it had settled into the kind of steady, grey persistence that Manhattan wore like a second skin in late October. Not dramatic, not violent, just relentlessly present, the kind of rain that soaked through the deliberate and the distracted alike. April noticed none of it. She was sitting in the back of her car, phone face down on the seat beside her, which was not a thing she typically did. Today it lay face down because the screen kept lighting up with a name she was not ready to engage with, and she had decided around 8 that morning that she was not going to be managed today. Marcus had retained a PR firm. She had learned this through 3 separate channels before 9 a.m. It was not accidental and not subtle, it was designed to be known. The narrative being constructed was careful and familiar, a story about a relationship that had simply run its course, told with just enough warmth to seem generous, and just enough implication to do its work quietly. His name appeared in 2 online publications by noon, adjacent to hers in the specific way that required no direct claim while making every indirect one. April had gotten in the car and given the driver Alexander's address. She found him exactly where she expected, beneath the Harley, boots visible, the sound of something being carefully adjusted filling the garage alongside the low percussion of rain on the metal roof. She sat on her stool without announcing herself. He would have heard the car, heard her steps on the concrete, heard the particular rhythm of her presence. He let her settle first, which was its own form of consideration. When he finally slid out and stood, wiping his hands, he looked at her face for exactly as long as it took to understand the general shape of what was happening. He didn't ask. He turned to the small office, came back with 2 mugs of coffee, set one beside her on the workbench, and returned to the Harley. He kept working. The silence lasted perhaps 10 minutes, not the silence of someone waiting for her to speak, but the silence of someone who had decided that presence was sufficient, and that she would find the words when she found them. Marcus hired a PR firm, she said. Alexander's hands didn't stop moving. I know. I saw the pieces this morning. You follow the financial press. I follow things that involve people I pay attention to. He said it simply, without drama. What's the narrative? Amicable. Mutual. His version of history dressed in the language of civility. The implication being that I walked away from something good because I couldn't make space for it. She wrapped both hands around the mug. And the reality? He asked. April looked at the rain moving down the high garage window in slow, irregular lines. The reality, she said, is that I spent 2 years with a man who was very skilled at making me feel that my perception of things was the variable most likely to be wrong. Not loudly. Not obviously. Just consistently. Every disagreement became a question of my interpretation. Every concern became evidence of my difficulty. She paused. By the end, I was spending more energy auditing my own reactions than running a company. The wrench in Alexander's hand went still. He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, he set the tool down on the workbench with a deliberateness that suggested he was choosing his response the way he chose his instruments, carefully, with an understanding of what the job actually required. He looked at her for a long moment. You didn't have anyone who stayed, he said. Not a question. Not pity. Something more precise than both, the quiet recognition of someone who had understood not just what she'd said, but what lived beneath it. The specific loneliness of a person who had been surrounded by people and still been profoundly alone in the places that counted. April felt something move in her chest. Not the collapse of a wall, it was never that clean, never that dramatic in real life. More like a seam loosening. A small structural shift that changed the way the whole thing bore weight. No, she said quietly. I didn't. Alexander held her gaze for another moment. Then he reached for his coffee, leaned against the workbench a few feet from her stool, and looked out at the rain with the expression of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't say you deserve better, or any of the phrases that sounded like comfort and functioned like distance. He stayed in the garage, in the rain, in the same room with a steadiness that made the air feel different, warmer, or perhaps just more honest. Outside, the rain continued its patient, unhurried work. And inside, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time began, almost imperceptibly, to breathe.